Hello. Welcome back to the first panel of the afternoon called Playing with the Past. Annie and I will be your chairs. Before we start, we would like to introduce our panelists for the section. Nicholas Bowman from Syracuse University, Alex Custodio from Concordia University, and Marc Lajeunesse from Concordia University. As before, each panelist will have 15 minutes to present their work, and we'll give you a signal when there's 5 minutes left and 1 minute left. The floor is yours, Dr. Bowman.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having us up. It's been a really fun morning so far, and it was especially a nice a presentation with the podcast. I'm going to be talking a bit, and the slides will be here soon, on some of my work that comes from a psychological background. So I'm going to be a bit of an evil empiricist for a moment. But I think you're going to see a lot of similarities in some of the basic thought constructs and concepts. And so I'm going to talk about, nostalgia in video games. That's the main idea today. Now, the nice thing about a conference like this is that we don't have to worry too much about going through the definitions of nostalgia, right? But what I could say, for example, if we go back one, is one of the things that when I talk to classes, when I talk to parents, when I talk to media, they often will be stuck in that presumption that when you say video game, you mean teenager. And really you mean white male teenager, but you certainly mean teenager. And so I'll show numbers at them, like if you look at the ESA, the software numbers from the United States, admittedly industry data, but gamers are 32 years old, right? And these people are playing 12 hours a week. You know, I think we've long moved past that idea that only a very narrow band of people play video games. But the reason some of the age statistics are especially important is they start speaking to what we can mean when we talk about having nostalgia, right? We can start thinking about a timeline. So if we go back to 61 being sort of the first video game, Space War at MIT, right, using a computational device to allow two people to play each other in Mortal Kombat locked around a stairwell in a PDP-1 mainframe, and all the way out to, well, this timeline's truncated because I needed to be on it at some point. And so I come in right before, the Nintendo, the NES, and of course when I talk to my students and ask them what retro gaming is to them, they will often say GameCube, and I'll shudder a little bit, a lot of bits. But it helps us know the coordinate space of what we're talking about when we talk about nostalgia. Now, this timeline is going to be important because one of my core arguments is that one of the things that's happening in gaming nostalgia is it's establishing a constructed history and even appreciation of the medium, especially among players who really are flabbergasted at some of these old mechanics and models that they're not exposed to anymore, things that I would have taken for granted. They're not seeing it that way. And there's definitely room to critique these things. I don't want to put sort of just a rosy picture on it all, but it suggests that we actually have a lineage, a history, something we can pull on, much in the way of an art historian or a film historian. And I've run this by my colleagues in art and film, and they don't immediately disagree with me, okay? So the screen behind me, what is that? That's Hyrule. Not so, it's Hyrule. This is one of my hometowns. I spent a stupid amount of time learning this place, loving this place, struggling in this place, right? That dumb part of the map over here where you can't actually go down, but you actually have to go left and then right and then up, and then you hear a musical cue, and then you can move on with your adventure. This is a hometown. And I don't think we think about it that way. And because I threw the box out when I bought the game, like all of us did. I didn't have the map. I had to draw it on paper. Hyrule is my hometown. St. Louis, Missouri is my hometown. And they both have meaning to the story of me, my experiences, what I talked about. Of course, what's neat about this one is how many of you have spent time there? Like, quite a few of us can go, oh yeah, I remember that part, I remember this part. You probably attach particular emotional reactions and experiences and conversations to different aspects of this town. It's something I wish we studied more. We do go back to these places. What's weird about game places is that they're changed but kind of not, because most time the content hasn't changed, but of course we have, the tech has, the screen has, the controller has. My basement doesn't smell like pizza anymore. Well, this one actually does, but you get the point there. We have a lot of nostalgia is tied up in senses. In fact, people argue that nostalgia is sensory emotion. And of course, games, being a multimodal medium, are going to trigger some of these senses. The feel of a controller. And anybody who's played retro games, quote unquote, and not used a modern controller knows what I'm talking about, where your mental model doesn't transfer over. It feels broken. Many of you can probably already hear the Punch-Out theme song, even though I'm not playing any audio, because it's enough of a cue to go, I see that pixel, I see that graphic, I hear the boom, boom, bing, and then I can start the game, right? We know that, and maybe a touch and smell. Anybody who's ever blown into a cartridge knows what I'm talking about, that particular sort of chemically smell after you clean an NES, right? These things aren't too surprising to us, of course. But games also have other elements that are nostalgic because they don't exist anymore. High scores and power bars sometimes are displayed oddly different in modern games. The debates around diegetic and non-diegetic space, right? But there are some weird elements, when we would play a game in the arcade, the high score was the social lineage you left behind. And a lot of us use the acronym ASS, because that was funny, and we didn't want to spell our names in the machine. So Ass is the best player in North America, right? But there are some of these soft aspects and bits that have gone away over the years for various reasons, and what makes them nostalgic, I think, is when they disappear, and we don't have the mental model for these bits of information. You can test this by having folks who haven't played these games will ask you questions like, what are those squares? What does high mean? Like, I don't get where that's going, because the reward system was different, right? The tech was different. Nostalgia can be broken up into personal nostalgia, remembering my own experiences, my own connections with a piece of information, but also historical nostalgia. These are quotes from studies we've done where we've had semi-structured interviews and open-ended data. The story of playing games with my dad, and then my dad passed away, and so my dad and Mario Kart are kind of the same memory for me, versus, wow, I played this game in your lab. I never heard of that weird stuff, but I know my parents gamed, and I bet you that's what they played. I think that's a fascinating finding, that they're reconstructing their parents' play experiences and then appreciating that, much in the way that we might study older music or older films, right? We are there with games now, and I want us to not look past this historical finding in particular. Some early findings for the work. A bunch of data models. One of the things we know, unsurprising, when you think of past memories, you're more nostalgic. Can you believe I made that prediction and supported it? But when you think of other people, you're only more nostalgic when you remember the social connections and relatedness in those relationships. So when those other people trigger up feelings of relatedness, it's a psychological need to feel connected. What you start to see is there's a social aspect to the game independent from the game itself. It's one concept here, right? That social aspect is going to come up often in this research, where people really are constructing an experience almost to the point where the game is kind of a MacGuffin for the memory of my family or my friends. It's that piece of the journey that you can't say it's irrelevant because it drove the entire experience, but sometimes they don't recall the game as much as they recall the people, and that can happen a lot. When we talk to folks in their qualitative themes, they will mention enjoyment. That shouldn't surprise you, but again, they mention it 40% of the time when they're talking about nostalgic memories, but only 16% of the time when they're talking about recent memories. That's kind of weird if people are playing for enjoyment, that they wouldn't even mention it as much, right? Challenge was interesting. A lot of folks, when they were recalling nostalgic games, would focus especially on the mechanics. What made them nostalgic were mechanics that don't seem to quite exist today. We didn't have story mode, so you just didn't win. I mean, a lot of people don't take it for granted that older NES games, you often didn't beat them. You just played them until the next one came out, because they were modeled off arcade games where you put quarters in. So there was really no, and when you won, it was, hey, you won. You want to play again? And then you just bought the next one in a couple of months. Childhood, that's not surprising. Let's go a little further. And I'm going to have a QR code at the end of my presentation that has all this data. I'm going to skip the WoW Classic stuff. I don't want to rain on parades, because you have a much deeper presentation on this. Controllers, we thought if we manipulated the controllers that people might have different nostalgic connections. using for a younger player, that NES controller is suddenly historical. That 2-button rectangle. And then maybe that pistol grip controller, that's actually pretty familiar. Well, I'm going to skip right past it because it didn't work at all. Part of it is they all played Mario, and my guess is Mario was plenty nostalgic without manipulating the controller. But we tried it again with Double Dragon 2 because Double Dragon 2 has more of these mental models tied to nostalgia that aren't in modern games. In this study is where we found out something kind of neat. This Johnson-Neyman distribution, but the important part of it is for people who identified as gamers, they had an almost eudaimonic appreciation for playing an old game. And when that hit a certain level, they started experiencing historical nostalgia. So these are 18-year-olds who see themselves as gamers, who have never played this game, don't know its mental models. They saw something deeper in the experience and then went, huh, yeah, older games, okay. That's what this whole thing's about. They're approaching it much in the way that people talk about approaching art. Much in the way they talk about approaching old film or old music. They're craving more after the lab, right? It's one finding. We've got to replicate this and expand it and complicate it, but there's a pathway here, okay? So what are some unanswered questions with the last couple of minutes that I'll have here? And this full notes are online. You know, one of the gamers talking about being born in the wrong era, which if you're a publisher, you find that one great quote, and that's the title of the paper. I was born in the wrong era. Historical nostalgia and something, something, something. And it's in the Psychology of Popular Media. And I'd love you to read it. And we can talk about it later. So a few unanswered questions in the last couple of minutes of my presentation. What makes something like this retro when the IP is completely new? How do we manufacture a retro feel for something that has no intellectual cultural history? So anybody played 9 Years of Shadows? I'm just curious. I work with these cats down in Guadalajara, and I've been asking them that question. They talk a lot about one of the struggles they've had. People get the pixel art and that, but they don't get the things like, why can't I carry more objects? Why can't I move backwards? Why can't I go on this part of the map? What I'm getting at is Metroidvanias actually had some relatively unique mental models that we didn't see in a lot of 3D games. And so younger players were struggling to understand, and they were critiquing the game because it wasn't Grand Theft Auto. And the developers were like, that was intentional. We're trying to make Metroid. What I'm getting at is these labels are not just labels. They actually have some design conventions behind them that go beyond just being pixels. And what's neat about the retro aspect and what makes them particularly attractive is they recycle old mental models, old ways of thinking about game mechanics. I might wonder, where's the weak spot on the bosses behind me? Anybody know? It's always the blinking red dot. That's just something you learn when you play video games in the 90s. If something blinks, it's a weak spot, right? If you've played Zelda Breath of the Wild, they also recycle this experience when you meet the huge cube monsters and things like that. But if these mechanics disappear, it's what makes them nostalgic. And suddenly it's, oh, I'm learning the meta model in these types of games. Somebody mentioned text-based adventure games earlier. I think that might be one of the next retro movements, is that, remember the game where you just walked up to if anybody's ever played a text game, the game was figuring out the language of the game. My favorite were the Laura Bow games, incidentally. I hope this doesn't play because I don't want to play the video. Maybe I can skip right by it. Right? Oh no, it's going to make us play it. You want to watch the entire Colonel's Bequest? No, we probably don't. One of my next slides that comes up here, there it is finally, and I think we're going to talk about this already, who are we nostalgic for? The slide went away, but we know, Amia's work talked about this, Dr. Gonsalvo's work, that the avatars and the stories and many of these retro properties were overwhelmingly white male. And so we might wonder about those relationships as people recall mechanics separately or not separately from experiences. That's another kind of mental model and representation. So if we just blindly recycle chiptune and pixel art, you also run the risk of blindly recycling a lot of portrayals that we've tried to grow past, although in the 10 years later study, we didn't really grow past any of it. So to conclude all of this, I'm happy to talk more. One of the reasons nostalgia works so well, it works as a psychological wellspring for temporary well-being. It's an analgesic. It doesn't fix everything. We do feel better when we recall our past. There is evidence to support that. But for gaming culture, what I like is that we might be seeing what's explaining the cultural moment in games in part is people are respecting it not just for the thing that's in front of us now, but there have been things in front of us for a long time, and they're showing interest in those things, not just to be a hipster or to own the most rare game, but because they're starting to appreciate sort of the lineage of the properties, which also allows us to build and remix and collect them. What is pop culture? Pop culture is remix culture. So I don't often critique the idea that we're remixing the past through retro to make new stuff. I think it's one of the best things that we can do. So I'd love to talk more. The last slide has my QR code. If you want to scan that, I'll go back. It also has a book chapter that some of these notes are written in with a lot more detail and citation. Okay? Thanks for having me.
Nick, thank you so much for your panel. Yeah. And thank you to your co-authors as well, Dr. Wulf, Dr. King, and Dr. Hodge.
Right.
Our next panelist is Alex Custodio. Please take it away, Alex.
Hello. So I'm going to apologize first for reading off my phone. I'm deeply nostalgic for computers with USB slots, which this one does not have. So my presenter slides don't work, and if they are showing the presenter view, then you can follow along. If it's just showing the slides, then hopefully I will cover it. Today, also in the spirit of nostalgia, I'm doing the very kindergarten thing of bringing in a show and tell object. So I will be talking about this. I do have it. If you want to look at it and play it later, you can come up to me and I'll be happy to share. It will also serve as a timer, my little timekeeping function for this presentation. So what is this item that I am showing off? Well, in 2021, Nintendo celebrated the 35th anniversary of the Legend of Zelda series with the release of a themed Game & Watch device, a modern reimagining of the company's earliest handheld electronic. The collectible contains 3 full games: the first Legend of Zelda, The Adventures of Link, and the original Link's Awakening for the Game Boy, which, not coincidentally, had received a very stunning 3D remake for the Switch 2 years prior to this. In addition to the main series titles, the handheld also includes a remake of the 1980 Game & Watch game Vermin, which is essentially kind of a whack-a-mole game, but there are a couple of notable changes. For one, Link replaces the very generic Game & Watch as the playable character, and the bevy of enemies are replaced with little Octoroks. So the entire game is rebranded in Zelda iconography. True to form, the system also includes a clock and an interactive timer, and both of those are themed around the Zelda series. This object is at once a backward-looking tribute to a much-beloved intellectual property and a contemporary reimagining of residual hardware. It impinges upon players' nostalgia not only for the Zelda series, but for Nintendo's corporate history much more broadly, harking back to the 4-bit calculator-inspired handhelds that launched their foray into the industry over 40 years ago. So in effect, this object represents a zenith in the commodification of nostalgia. It's the distillation of affective relations to both a brand and its intellectual property, all resold for the neat price of $69.99. And I, of course, fell for it. I am, after all, the target audience for this object. I've been playing Zelda game for nearly 30 years now, following Link as he moves from platform to platform, encountering him in more remakes, re-releases, and remasters than I can count. And indeed, to date, there are more remakes and re-releases of Zelda games than there are original games in the series. This penchant for visiting existing games, revisiting existing games, is very much central to Nintendo's business model. We can see this most clearly in the succession of online stores that have accompanied each of their network platforms for the last 17 years, beginning with the Wii Shop channel back in 2006. Through their emulator-based virtual console, the company purported to offer a treasure trove of gaming's rich history, holding up classic of titles as artifacts of gaming systems from the past. But these games had never been lost to time. They had remained accessible by way of hobbyist practices. And when I talk about hobbyist practices, I refer to a vast umbrella of interactions from modifying, maintaining, repairing, and even redesigning hardware to emulating, translating, hacking, and remixing software. These activities, which often occur at the peripheries of legality, unfold in ways that Nintendo neither intended nor predicted. And these unsanctioned efforts have, in effect, preserved the very nostalgia that sells objects like this one. So in this presentation, I want to tease out some of the tensions between corporate and hobbyist practices through the lens of nostalgia. And specifically, I contend that Nintendo's strategic deployment of intellectual property participates in this platformization of nostalgia, whereby they're profiting off of hobbyist practices and at the same time really striving to eliminate them in a fundamental way. So what is platformization? I won't go into it in too much detail, but broadly speaking, it refers to the consolidation of cultural production into narrow, controlled channels that attempt to restrict user agency. So think anything by Google, Meta, Amazon, Apple, all consolidating news to entertainment in these very controlled channels. Under the platformization model, companies extract users' creative output while simultaneously controlling it through stringent technical protection measures as well as the threat of legal sanction. And once you're in this platform ecosystem, it's usually very difficult to get back out. For decades, though, Nintendo had grudgingly tolerated hobbyist practices. Occasionally, they have even credited their fans for ideas that they've implemented in their own industrial design, such as in the case of the Game Boy Advance SP, where the lead designer, Kenichi Sugino, had actually acknowledged modders' interventions into backlighting their handheld. This moment of candor, although quite rare though it might be, lifts the veil on the way that Nintendo and their fans have long engaged in this dialogue with material consequences, remixing hardware and software in this very characteristically iterative design process. And so we see this in the case of emulation. So since the mid-2000s, Nintendo has developed platform-specific emulators to provide players with access to their back catalog. As a general definition, an emulator is a piece of hardware or software that allows one computer system, known as the host, to play software that was designed for another computer system, known as the guest. So that's what's at work over here in Nintendo's Virtual Console, which was a distribution system that allowed users to buy games for systems like the NES, the Super NES, and the Game Boy, and then play them on their Wii, Wii U, and 3DS. The launch of the first Virtual Console in 2006 was strategic for several reasons. When Nintendo president Satoru Iwata first introduced the Wii at E3, he claimed that it would redefine backward compatibility through the ability to download 20 years of Nintendo content. By then, the people who would want to revisit those 20 years of content, who had an affective relationship to those 20 years of content, were also the people who are having children. So the Virtual Console wasn't just this way to relive the halcyon days of gaming past, it was also a way to introduce an entirely new generation to the system. And they would do so on the console that those children would then become nostalgic for. So just as we heard in the last presentation, the idea of the controller, now these people who are learning how to play video games on the Wii or with the GameCube controller, which could connect to the Wii, will become nostalgic for that controller and learn all of these old games on that material platform. So there's layers upon layers of nostalgia at work over here. There are also material reasons behind the convenient timing of the Virtual Console, and that has to do with the decline of hardware. So as platforms age, their availability dwindles, their increased rates of operability, they're no longer being made, you can't replace them. So the NES was discontinued in 1995, the Super NES was discontinued in 1999, and the Game Boy was discontinued in 2003. So up until that point, you could still buy the consoles, but after that it became very difficult to play the software that you purchased by legitimate means. The other thing is that these cartridges for these systems also had a built-in life expectancy. So nowadays, save data is much more reliable. But back then, it was actually battery-backed. And these little batteries that you see over here, which were in every single one of the cartridges to maintain the save data, would die after about 10 to 20 years. Enter the virtual console. You've just lost your save. You can now play it again. And your Wii is going to store it. Isn't this great? Yes, okay, sure. Well, we'll get to that and how great that is in a minute. But really, by designer default over here, Nintendo's re-release of the games on the Virtual Console's emulation system acknowledges the obsolescence of their own hardware. So emulation decouples software from the hardware on which it's intended to run, and it recognizes the fallibility of that hardware. So materially decontextualized though these emulators might be, they offer a way to continue to engage with vast software libraries of residual media. Of course, hobbyists have known this for a really long time. Long before the launch of the Virtual Console, amateur programmers have reverse engineered Nintendo's code to create their own emulators, making them free to use on nearly any operating system. From this flourished robust communities that played, remixed, and reimagined Nintendo properties. So ROM hackers brought to life games by creating new levels, writing new stories, randomizing gameplay, or even mashing up franchises in crossovers between Mario and Link, or Link and Metroid, all thanks to meticulous study of the source code and memory banks, the hardware. Players exploited glitches to create inventive metagames, including speedrunning, where the goal is to complete a game as fast as possible. Fans painstakingly translated entire games that Nintendo decided were not worth the cost to localize, editing hours worth of text character by character in the esoteric back end of the code in order to bring these games overseas, which Nintendo now profits from in their remakes or their gacha games like Fire Emblem Heroes, where players can collect characters from games that never made it here by official means, but they're still nostalgic for these characters by playing these fan translations. So the games from the past that Nintendo purported to rescue with their Virtual Console really hadn't been left in the past at all. For decades, hobbyists had been sustaining interest in these properties independent of Nintendo's commercial concerns. Frank Cifaldi, founder of the Video Game History Foundation, openly attributes the success of Nintendo's back catalog to the popularity of free emulators, saying that he doesn't believe that the business he's in even exists without emulation. So online communities of amateur programmers and fan enthusiasts really prove the market for things like the Virtual Console, as they did with the object here that I'm holding that I started the slides. So in the little time I have left, I just want to place the Game & Watch in the context of Nintendo's two-pronged business model. I want to go over 3 shifts that we've seen specifically between 2017 and 2018. I'll try to go through these quickly because I'm aware of time. But first, Nintendo launched 2 immensely punitive lawsuits those years against websites hosting ROMs and a brick-and-mortar shop in Ontario that sold mod chips and game copiers. Both of the suits were demanding awards in the order of $12 million, and the verdicts really took the internet by storm for what it said about technical protection measures, etc. Historically, Nintendo really relied on takedown notices and cease and desist letters, relying on what's known in legal circles as the chilling effect, which is the discouragement of the legitimate exercise of rights through threat of legal sanction. But in the weeks that followed these cases, a bunch of websites, including Emu Paradise, which had typically been like a host since the turn of the millennium for ROMs, took down all of their Nintendo content without Nintendo having to lift a finger against them for their own self-preservation. These suits also coincided with the launch of the NES and Super NES Classic Edition consoles, which, similar to this Game & Watch device here, are mini replicas of the NES and Super NES and their Famicom counterparts in Japan that use emulation engines and are each loaded with a couple of dozen games, and these flew off the shelves. So the fact that Nintendo struggled to keep up with demand was really proof of an appetite for these objects for their history. And both the ROM site crackdown and the launch and relaunch of the Classic Edition consoles followed in the wake of an announcement of the closure of the Wii Shop channel, because you can't actually own these digital objects forever. So for years now, the gaming industry has been moving from direct unit sales of self-contained objects towards an economy based off of in-app purchases, downloadable content, and subscription services. And so the Virtual Console, even though it was profitable for what it was, has been now shut down for something else, which is the Nintendo Switch Online, which is a subscription service. So through the NSO, Nintendo's now in the process of migrating their back catalog to something that you cannot own, something over which they maintain both control and oversight. So no longer can you claim that you've bought the game, you should be allowed to back it up wherever you want, you should be able to use it however you want. You cannot claim that anymore. You're effectively renting these games from Nintendo. So this tactic at once really reinterprets and rearticulates Nintendo's legacy, and also competes with this emulation ecosystem developed by hobbyists to challenge this very model. Nintendo's representing its own history, emulated, and in this model of emulator being discontinued, another emulator discontinued, cannibalizing its own history and frustrating players' attempts at ownership. And then for those of us who are more materially inclined, we get this, which are these little evocative packages, these tiny, neat little summations of nostalgia, reabsorptions of their own history that mimics the work of ROM hackers, emulator coders, and modders who were making objects similar to these in the past. And even this repackaging is nostalgic, right? 135 years ago, when Nintendo first started, they were making collectibles. They were making handmade Hanafuda playing cards. So they've been in the collectible industry for a very long time. This is also kind of a nostalgic reimagining of their own corporate past. Now they're selling us tangible material nostalgia. And of course, they're retro in a distinctively contemporary manner, right? As Svetlana Boym writes of reflective nostalgia, the objects don't seek to reproduce the past. What they're really doing is imbuing the present with an evocation of pastness. This beautiful backlit screen would not have existed back then. So Nintendo states on their website that they're famous for bringing back to life their very profitable characters, and only they have the right to profit from it. But the difficulty is that Nintendo does little to preserve each instantiation, or indeed the aging hardware on which these games are designed to run. So the company is right in noting how famous their properties are, but that only serves to highlight the importance of their preservation for video game history. So the Wii Shop channel's closure in 2018 and the Wii U and 3DS's eShop closure last year proved that the Virtual Console is not going to be that archive. With each closure, these vast libraries became inaccessible, proving that digital ownership is in fact just as ephemeral, and the infrastructures that are designed to sustain it are designed for obsolescence. Right, and the film industry learned this the hard way. We've seen, before 1950, we only have about 50% of those movies, and before 1929, we've lost 90% of the films. So the thing that Nintendo really seems to forget about nostalgia is that it exists fundamentally within people who remember their adventures playing, hacking, modifying, breaking, and sharing these games. So these tendencies towards platformization have significant implications for fans' engagement with a flourishing participatory culture that actually sustains the cultural cachet of Nintendo names. So by cutting off these efforts, Nintendo really fails to recognize why these properties have such staying power in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you for the amazing presentation, Alex. Our final panelist is Marc Lajeunesse. Go ahead, Marc.
Hello. How's it going? I'm going to wait for the slides. I'm also going to stand. You're all in this circle of trust. Presenting that way. You're included, though. It's here. No, that's very far. Let's go all the way back. Nope, that's the end. Nostalgia, it flows in various ways, temporally. All right, hi, how's it going? Podcast voice. So this is my presentation, Nostalgic Disjuncture in the Past Not Traveled Until Now in World of Warcraft Classic. That's a big title with some big words in it, and most of this presentation is me explaining what this title means to you by the end. What is this project? Much like the Dire Maul ogre that is in front of you, the one pictured, not myself, this project is still cooking. So recently I've done a very long ethnography of a bunch of virtual worlds, including World of Warcraft. It was not on Nostalgia or World of Warcraft Classic, but being embedded in those spaces means you hear a lot about this, and I did a bunch of interviews, and people always wanted to talk about this because World of Warcraft Classic is a part of the current World of Warcraft game, and it means a lot to folks. So, through those interviews and a bunch of external research, I've scraped together a bunch of data to kind of tell an interesting story about what World of Warcraft Classic is and how it is kind of interesting as a artifact of nostalgia, which may become a paper in the future at some point with my lovely friend Andre Zanescu, Doctor of Media and Communication. Nostalgic disjuncture is the theoretical term I have employed here. It is a part of hauntology, which I'm not going to get into because in a nostalgia conference we have already covered hauntology. But the key feature of hauntology that I'm employing here is called temporal disjuncture, which is the idea that an object out of time can produce a kind of incongruous state when you are perceiving it, right? The idea that there is a break between the object from the past and the current experience of that past object. Sensible stuff, right? Nostalgic disjuncture is about the re-experience of that moment or object, and that's kind of what World of Warcraft Classic fits into. It is the rebuilding of the old world of World of Warcraft in the present day. And nostalgic disjuncture is this idea that there is an incongruity among players experiencing this where it doesn't line up with the original experience. That's enough theory. What is World of Warcraft? It's a video game that was released in 2004. If you're all familiar with Fortnite now, World of Warcraft was Fortnite then, and that it was the biggest popular game of its time. What do you do in this video game? Well, you make an avatar. This is one of them. And you go out into this simulated world. You do quests. In these quests, you complete like tiny objectives that give you very tiny rewards that give you that dopamine hit because you get a tiny reward that makes you feel as though the work that you have put into the game is of some value to you, which is its own talk. Not a presentation with my therapist. You also socialize with people. Here, there's a group of people who are actually players, and they're trying to achieve a task together, which is killing this monster who is a lady inside of a tornado. This is the kind of thing you do in World of Warcraft. And you might be saying, why? Who does this? Who cares? Great question. Turns out, no, too far. Return. To the past, yes. Turns out a lot of people, especially over time. So what we have here, oh, it's going to go forward again now. What we have here is the player base of World of Warcraft over time in millions of players. You may notice that at its peak, around 2010, World of Warcraft had 12 million players. That's a lot of people who are very interested in this play loop. It's a lot of people for whom the early experience of World of Warcraft is a very effective emotional thing. It is a hotbed of nostalgia, right? But the important thing to take away from this is that when World of Warcraft released, it was a kind of simple game, still large, especially at the time, but as time went on, they released more and more expansions, and what did these do? They add content to the game, but most importantly, they changed the way the game feels over time. And as that happens, you can also see that around here, with this expansion, there starts to be a steady decline in the player base of the game. A few things happen at this time that explains why this happens. One is they destroy the old World of Warcraft and they rebuild it with new things. And players didn't really enjoy that, right? I mean, some did. There was a newness to it, but over time, there was this feeling of missing the past. The other thing that happened is around that time, there were some ideological shifts at Blizzard Entertainment, the company that makes World of Warcraft, that change how the game plays socially. And so the social experience of play, which is important in a multiplayer game like this, was vastly different. There was less connection or less perceived connection between players. And so over time, players started to crave that a bit more. Just to give a sense of how much the world has changed, this is what the map of World of Warcraft was in 2004. Now in 2024, these two continents here are those two things here. There's all this added in the middle, and if you pull back, there are multiple other worlds that you get to participate in, which can be a lot, right? So people were clamoring for a return to the past. A simple past. And in fact, at BlizzCon, which is the festival of Blizzard entertainment that celebrates itself, and it's kind of the press release thing, there was this infamous moment where a player with a question asked, "Have you ever thought about adding servers for previous expansions as they were then?" To which the then president and not great person, J. Allen Brack, then production director of WoW, if you don't want to know why, you can Google it, said, "No! And by the way, you don't want to do that either. You think you do, but you don't." Spoiler alert, he was horribly wrong, but he's also a bit of a jerk in this moment. So there was a huge player demand for, like, can we go back to the past? Because a lot of us, the thing we fell in love with was the old version of this game. We don't like what you're doing to our play experience. We don't like the way the world has changed. And maybe we do, but we also miss the good old days, right? If they were even good. Blizzard wouldn't do it, so players took it upon themselves to make their own servers that were the past, right? So they went back to 2004. The game, kind of as it originally was, it wasn't fully. They made slight changes. But this is a thing that players wanted. So this is Nostalrius. It ran from 2015 to 2016, which isn't a very long time. And there's a good reason why it didn't run a very long time. It's because Blizzard said no, even though they weren't planning on doing it themselves. They were like, cease and desist. And Nostalrius was like, yeah, sure. So, you know, taking a page out of Nintendo's book, Blizzard was like, we're going to shut it down, even though we're not going to do this thing ourselves. But it turns out they did it themselves. And in 2019, they finally caved to the pressure and were like, we're going to release this thing, World of Warcraft Classic. The premise of this is simple. We're going to release the game as it was in 2004, and we're going to run through all the expansions in a condensed time frame from 2004 until they'll see what happens. We're now in, 2024. They're going to that expansion now that blew up the world that people didn't like. So they're facing this really interesting conundrum where they've run through the nostalgia, the positive goodwill and the good feeling nostalgia of the content that they have mined as a product for their player base. But as this happened, the promise of going back in time was something that players realized, well, that's not actually something you can do. This isn't the way this is going to go. And there's a few reasons that happened. One, in rebuilding the classic server, they started using new technology. Technology that wasn't available in 2004 to make the game run better, to make the stresses of the server less. And so Nostalrius ran on really old tech, and you can see in the world, it's populated, it's full of players. Those are all players congregated together. During the first stress test for Classic, this is what it looked like. Because WoW now uses this layering technology where you can imagine we're all in this space together, there are a lot of us congregated here, and we all get to see each other and share the same space. But in WoW, it's a simulation. And so even if you're on the same server as someone, if there are too many people, it's going to create a new copy of the world, and you will not see each other even though you are in the same space, to make it so the servers run better and so that people's computers run better. Right? But what this does in a simulated world like World of Warcraft, it makes it feel empty. And so players were like already, oh, something's not right here. This isn't going to be like it was in 2004. Now, they changed this before it launched, but the feeling in players was already there that this isn't going to be the same. More things happened. Like, the game came out in 2004 and people have already played it. Everything had been discovered in the game. Everyone knew how to do every challenge that was in the game. So in 2004, we had the internet, but things weren't as established. There weren't these huge databases. There weren't tons of YouTube streamers. There wasn't Twitch. There wasn't the same amount of information. So if there are secrets that you're looking for in the game, if you want to know how to kill a boss, like Onyxia here, who's one of the biggest bosses in the game, it took 70 or so days to kill her originally in 2004. When she re-released in Classic, it took 10 days, right? Like, the thing that the players are looking for is actually not obtainable because the world has changed. Also, people do different things in WoW now than they did in 2004. And much to the shock of players, people are like, oh, I wish people wouldn't do this in Classic. because I want it to be like it's 2004. It's never going to happen. This includes the social context of the game. There was, and a lot of the folks I interviewed brought this up, a lot of Trump chat in WoW Classic that didn't exist in 2004. Just the state of American politics really affected what the in-game experience is. And remember, if you're coming to a game like this, it's a social experience that you're looking for. But the social experience cannot possibly be the same. The world has moved on. And the player base, as we've talked about before, like gamers are older now than they were before. The player base is older, and one of the things a lot of players wanted to do was go back to the days when they were in high school, early days of college, when they had a lot of free time, and remember like marathoning days or weeks of WoW, right? No-lifing is what it's called. And it's not really possible when you have bills and a job and a family and all that stuff. So players, as they started playing, were like, oh, but it can't actually happen. And so there's this informal thing that has started called retirement servers. One such retirement server is called Old Blanchy, named after the pictured horse. And this is where older gamers go to try and collectively play in a world where everyone agrees, again, informally, that we're gonna take it slow. We don't have to rush to progress the end game. We don't have to rush to find secrets. We're all in this together, moving at our own pace. And I do have to read this quote verbatim from WoW Wiki. Blanchy was the horse of Theodore and Verna Furlbrow. She was tired due to a lack of oats, which I think describes a lot of us. Also, fun fact about Blanchy, in the Cataclysm expansion, she gets killed. And now she gets to relive it again this year when they re-release it for Classic. Good job, horse. So this is the main sentiment that I want to get to. This is from one of my interviewees talking about trying to recapture the past through all of these obstacles that you can't really do, right? The magic that they had is when they raided, that's killing bosses together with old friends. But the magic's gone. It can't be replicated, and he keeps trying to get that. And this is that nostalgic disjuncture, right? There are a lot of players who are trying to achieve this, and I think if you sit in that moment, you're going to have a bad time. And for this person specifically, every new patch, every new expansion, everything that comes out, he keeps trying to get this because the promise is there. The idea that you can get back there is somewhere in our heads, even though it can't really be done. And Blizzard knows this. Blizzard understands this, and they were never really trying to go all the way back anyway. Players in this experience were like, okay, so 2004 WoW is not possible. So they started doing other things. They started playing in new ways, putting impositions upon their playstyles, an informal way of, if you die in the game, normally, you just resurrect and you continue on. But informally, players made a kind of hardcore playstyle where if you die, you are committed to deleting your character. That's something players were doing to spice it up, to make it new. And Blizzard Entertainment was like, okay, let's make hardcore servers. Blizzard was also players were demanding of Blizzard, can you make an experience that's more fresh, something where I don't know everything, where I can't just go on a database and find out all the answers to this game? And they were like, okay, we'll make Season of Discovery, where we changed what the end game looks like, we put new abilities into the game, we're not gonna play test this publicly, you just go in and go, so you get the exploration feel. Even though the artifact is not exactly the same, it's capturing that nostalgic thing. And this produces new possibilities for playing, where in this classic hardcore server, they've made a fight club to the death because in a guild, there was a loot dispute where one person got an item another player wanted, and he challenged him to a duel to the death. So now there's new emergent play practices and design practices from what players have been doing through Classic, not being able to achieve the actual nostalgic moment. And so the moral of the story is, we're kind of now exploring an alternate design trajectory for World of Warcraft. And it's, I think the main thing I would like you guys to take away from this is like, are there other ways to achieve this in other media objects and other games and our music where you're going back? I mean, hauntology is like a genre or form of doing music is getting to this too. But it's really interesting to see this in iterative game design, especially at the AAA big budget level, where this is not normally what happens. In indie, you can make these decisions, and it's really rare to have a company this big go all out and be like, players are doing things, let's go back to the past and iterate on a design from 20 years ago. And they've done it twice, and they're probably going to do it again. So that's kind of the point of the talk. Now you know what nostalgic disjuncture is, probably, and you've met old Blanchy. Rest in peace. Bless her soul. Thanks, guys.
Amazing, Mark. Thank you so much. Okay, that concludes the panel portion of this segment. The floor is open now for questions.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this panel. It was very stimulating. Oh, I have one question for all three panelists. It's the easy one. I was wondering what the role of augmented reality is in synergizing and actualizing the nostalgia in the games. It's used actually to reproduce the experiences of neurodegenerative diseases. And I was wondering whether augmented reality plays the same role in nostalgic experience associated with video games. The second question is for the last speaker, since you were the most, how do you say, buoyant and inspiring. I was wondering how this notion of killing or incinerating the previous generation of games and recreating is associated with the notion of dialectical heteronomy. Let's start with the Heideggerian notion of the Das Sein, and how the experiences prior to one's conception are unknown. If we move to Emmanuel Levinas, he resolved this notion with that concept of dialectical heteronomy, in which he proposed that the only way to feel, how do you say, connected with that unattainable, barred reality that preceded one's own existence, the best course of solution was really to kill old Blanche, as you put it. In the case of Levinas, actually, he showed that in order to have this omniscience, one would have to kill his own father. But that seems to be doing that seems to be the same process that the video game industry is trying to, how do you say, pay. So I was wondering whether you see the same tendency. Are there any inspirations from that line of philosophical reasoning? Is that what is the basis for the ontology or even the hauntology? Thank you.
So like the first question, so that was about like augmented reality. I mean, like I haven't played the Nintendo Labo, so I can't really say much about that. Like I'm not, like Nintendo's not super invested in the augmented reality just yet, so there's like, who's to say what comes before it. But like, yeah, that doesn't really, right now it's very much looking back at what they've already done and repackaging that, less looking at like forward technology, but who knows what'll come in the future.
Yeah, it's difficult because with augmented reality, one of the difficulties is certainly you can remove a piece of text and show it again. But my quick presumption, and I do some AR, VR work as well in the lab, is that you get to a point, and it kind of transitions into your question here, that you're borrowing so little of the experience that it's not that we wouldn't have an attachment if I had Pokemon in my environment like Pokemon Go, right? But it starts to become less and less about the nostalgia of a particular artifact or a particular game, and probably more about being its own experience. Pokemon Go is probably the closest I can think of that kind of weaves this thread between, oh, hey, look, Pokemon, I remember catching them, but who's played Pokemon Go? The game has almost nothing in common with the original games. And in fact, they had to change a lot of the rules, a lot of the mechanisms to make it actually work in the experience. So my guess is that you will see AR augmentation used in the way that we see paratext used. Posters, commercials, stickers, t-shirts, hats. But I don't think you'll see it used to replicate fully some of these experiences, only because you get to the point, there's a great example in the late 90s, early 2000s, where someone made Super Mario Brothers from 1984 in 3D. It's really more of an art performance than a game because the game just does not work. And it was more them playing with new technologies. Now, that could be the case, however, that AR games today could leave experiences for later that could potentially get into some of the same retro characteristics. But my guess is you're seeing an example of us essentially, it's really hard. It's one thing to package Zelda up into a plastic container for the watch. It's an entirely different thing. They've tried it with Pac-Man, they've tried it with Pokemon, and at some point it just becomes a fundamentally different experience that we lose the connection to.
Yeah, so on the augmented reality front, with WoW, I'm not too sure. And I mean, the immersive qualities of WoW, it's not necessarily about the augmented reality, but kind of the state of mind that a player enters when they are engaging with the game, particularly in a situation when you can know life and play for days at a time and kind of enter this kind of hypnosis kind of when you're playing it, right? So it's not augmented reality in the technological sense that where we use it now in the design sense, but you are trying to augment your reality in terms of the connection to the game, and that's one of the things that was being sought out, and the idea that you could get back there to that moment in 2004 through playing this game. You could, like, I don't know, relive your youth, or like Coherent Avenger, the person I spoke to, was like, I really wish I had the friends then that I have now, and like playing through the game, can it get those? To the other question, the idea with connection with the reality that precedes one's own experience. So the interesting thing about WoW Classic is that, especially thinking about nostalgic disjuncture, is that like you didn't actually have to play the game in 2004 to have that connection. It can be mediated or remediated for you, and then you get the idea of what the experience is, right? It's kind of like the Paris syndrome thing, where Japanese tourists have an idea from their own culture about what Paris is. You go there, and it produces acute or clinical depression in you because the Paris of reality is not the Paris of Japanese media, right? Or tourism brochures. And I think in that way, the connection is actually pretty strong between players who had the idea of what Classic is without the actual experience. Classic is huge. There's 800,000 players. WoW right now only has 1.2 million. So it's a pretty large chunk of what the player base is. And a lot of the positive feedback seems to be coming from players who had no idea or had no prior experience actually playing Classic. It's the opposite of Paris syndrome, where like, oh, this is way better than I thought it was going to be, even though it's old, right? Like that's part of what it is. But they also have no concept of that, like the social environment is way different than it was in 2004, even though it appears to be the same. And it's not a big deal for them because they're only used to the way it is in the present, which is limiting. Players are separated from one another, and so they don't feel that lack in that way. And then the idea of having to kill your own father to know this. So I think of this less as a killing and more of a resurrection, but the resurrection is a zombie. Like, it's not the same. And I think in a lot of retro game remakes, this can kind of be a thing. We see this a lot, Final Fantasy VIII remake. Any game that is like remade and repackaged to be like, this is the way it was, but improved. The improvement is actually kind of like its walking corpse that you have to contend with because it's almost never going to be the thing that you really want it to be. Yeah.
Thank you. I had a question for Nick. A lot of your research is sort of focusing around almost, I don't know a better way to put this, defending the honor of old games, sort of. And some of the studies were like exposing people who had never been exposed to games and being like, how does it feel? And especially like one quote, of course, that stuck out to me, stuck out to you as well, was the wish I'd been, or born in the wrong era, something like that. Was the attempt to have these studies, rather for awareness or for defending an honor, was that something you went into them with, or was that sort of a feeling, like, did you feel that when you started doing these studies, you needed to expose these people to it?
So there's two answers, right? There's the me search. There's the 42-year-old with a lot of old games who just found out he can study those and continue doing his job. And that's pretty neat. And I have little nieces and nephews, and I show them old games, and I sit back and go, yeah, see, that's it. You're doing great, Padawan, right? But in truth, I didn't expect to do any of the historical nostalgia research. I was only interested in studying older players who had gone back and had the experience to retouch something because the technology had been made available to them. So the very first research, we were going out in the community trying to find adults 18 to 49 who can come to the lab and play games, and we're going to give you these old games, and we're going to see how they make you feel. Going into some of the psychological research in nostalgia is this temporary wellspring of well-being, especially during tragic and stressful times. Well, y'all work on a college campus, and getting that population isn't easy, especially if you don't have a grant. And so then we started going, okay, well, we'll get older players, but we'll also recruit college players as sort of a comparison group. And the idea being, well, we shouldn't see personal nostalgia among the younger players because they should be like, what are you handing me? Then we decided to start using some of the nostalgia scales that measure personal and historical. Really is just a validation check. And that's when the historical stuff came out. So I think it's a combination of, wow, we didn't expect that graph I showed, that if you read the paper, it literally says, post hoc analysis, we just came up with this with the data because we never thought about this, but this is super crazy and I have a reason to believe it. Please publish us even though we didn't predict this. It is probably a combination of seeing that data emerge and seeing them both talk about like, wow, this must have been what it was like, which is also what I am often foisting on my nieces and nephews. And that's why I say it has two answers. I can't say that nothing in my positionality picked up on that in a way that maybe I wouldn't have picked up on it, but it really did emerge from those studies. Now, these are college students on a campus getting credit and money to be in studies. It was probably really fun to come play Double Dragon for half an hour in between your classes. But it was completely unexpected to see those historical nostalgia, both the scale items where they're like this, respecting the medium, but really the way they would talk about it. And the one that really stuck out to me was this notion of them connecting with their family through these like imagined experiences. Like you got the impression they were gonna go home that week and be like, hey mom, did you ever play this game called Double Dragon 2? And I could imagine me going, why yes, yes I did. So this is an area I wanna go into more. In fact, the family, the intergenerational connection is the one that I think is the most exciting. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I think we're going to take one online.
Yes, this is from Carl Terrien. First off, Carl says, thank you, Nick, Alex, and Marc. This question is for Alex. In light of the general shift towards subscription-based models, are there any tips on how we can resist? Hobbyist cultures are obviously doing it, but for a broader audience?
I mean, can't say emulate games. I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that. Oh, wait. One of the things is just like looking at, these have existed for a while, but like used game stores are great. A lot of them are, closing. A lot of them did close during the pandemic, but they do still exist and actually have been starting to crop up yet again. And I think there is this general push. Michael also found in Montreal, there are like really cool game stores. So maybe we could make a blog post and put it on the Residual Media Depot website of like places even just in Montreal where you can go to get games. And like these things are, doing that work of giving you the option to actually purchase physical media. And I think people are starting to realize that it is important to purchase physical media. I think, currently we're in the transition period where they're shutting down the Wii shop on the Wii U shop and the 3DS shop. And this is critical not only because the games that you paid for are not going to be working anymore on the systems that you paid for, but the fact that a lot of content was made as downloadable content or online content, and these servers are shutting down. So games like Fire Emblem that have these robust online activities and these items that you could only get online are now being taken out of the game, and the games are incomplete. And so I'm imagining if, given what has historically happened, continues to happen, we will see these fan servers pop up online to be able to actually get those games. But it comes down to a question of preservation and where, what is preserving our games, what aspects of gameplay are being preserved and how. And so, projects like the Residual Media Depot and Ludov at the UDM and projects that are looking at preserving this old hardware, and then online projects too, the fan projects to support those as ways of getting this archived, because otherwise Nintendo and other game companies are running on this model where you're just subscribing to the games and they have complete control over it and can erase aspects of their history that they don't want to preserve. So yeah, thank you for the question. It's a great question.
That is all the time we have for questions. I would like to conclude our panel called Playing with the Past and thank our presenters. Okay, so we'll be having another section of our event coming up next called the Research Creation Hour. For the time being, please go and get yourself some coffee or a snack. And actually, before then, I'll pass it off to Richie.
Thank you, colleague Derek. Wow, I'm gonna flesh it out as long as I can. My goodness, Alex, Dr. Bowman, Dr. Lajeunesse, Marc, I don't know, yeah. Folks, wow, we can, you're right, we can play with the past. Sometimes the past plays with us too. So you can see here the generativity that we're trying to put out, right? Different forms of bottles, right? I know we say it's a time in a bottle, etc. How do we contain time? How does time contain us? But there is generativity out of it. If time, the things that we capture, is comparable to water or liquid within a bottle, then don't just drown in it. Don't just let it marinate and sit there. Put some drops out there. Let it grow, nurture from it, but don't dwell in it too much because it can drown you too. So in that spirit, we are now going to move on to a more material, more tangible. Hey folks, come on in. More material, more tangible sorts of realizations of that metaphor of the bottle, right? What it is that we use to not only take time, convey time, but convey time. Chronophobia, as we talked about in the beginning by Svetlana Boym, it's not so much a fear of time, but a buzzing anxiety from the individual, from a collective, a more philosophical, where's my hometown, right? And that sometimes brings players to mod their own pathways, their junctures from their disjunctures that they meet, right? All the way to the collective level of Blizzard believing that, no, this is the past that you should have, right? There's always that clash. So let's flesh that clash out by going with the research creation. And I'm just going to talk briefly, introduce them, each individual research creationist. I think that's a nice word for it. Ainsley Leggett, who is going to do how to make peanut butter balls. And it's a funny name, but it's got quite an interesting story. Just the video over there, that corner, and you'll be able to see it. Basically recording herself and her children, following the recipe of an Aunt Willow, that they've never met, to create and taste that time, that personal loss, that feeling of, oh, I wish I could go back to that historical nostalgia personally by making. Breaking bread together, thinking about it, right? So that's there. Nancy Long, in art education as well, PhD, also has another thing on food, I suppose, but a little more graphic one. So she's prepared a little cupboard for you to open up, put headphones on, and see how you feel about what you see in there. That's all I'll say. Then Kelly Day, fantastic. Kelly Day's piece is a fairy tale book, true story, based on her own experiences with the past, and it's very generative. I met Kelly personally. Your story is still with me, and I'll continue to hold on to it, so that's all I'll say. Notice the way she uses the materials to allegorize that fairy tale, right? There's going to be a little research card to say about what it is, and ask Kelly yourself. Really notice the way the materials convey meaning. That's all I'll say. Divergent Fables by Kamyar and Rebecca. Where you at? There you are. Bring out your phones, right? Download the QR code app. It'll take you to a web app. There's a prompt there, little Red Riding Hood, etc., for you to take a photo of whatever captures that folklore, that fairy tale for you, right? And talk about it, debate about it. The seat's right here. Made by the Bottle, Esther Clark. Phenomenal. It traces her career with robots and influence and of her own relationship with her mother as well. You can see she traces her influence of robots in media and what it produced, right? What we talked about, that drop of generativity in your collected bottle, how much it can grow. I was expecting more of a clap there. This is a symposium, you know what I mean, folks? You want to know what the difference between a conference symposium? This right here. Lisa Conway, reimagining the Alphorn. Lisa, in my PhD cohort as well, sociology, and you're in Indy, in the individualized program, who uses her Swiss identity to go back, and Alphorn is an interesting instrument in the Swiss Alps, right? And talking about something quite nostalgic with something very analog. Listen in, listen to her, listen to each other. And myself, Bottled Up Time, a set. You want to know about it? Have a read. It's right there. And with that, hit it! Okay. This is the nostalgic disjuncture right here. I was hoping for something more, grand.